And good day to everybody here. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome. We are continuing our series, although it's not an official part of the several-part series we did at an earlier time, but a continued series on the MCMI-IV, and with the mission in mind of being able to move beyond just the very simple diagnostic labels that the instrument provides, which helps us with incremental validity, which helps us clarify diagnoses, but moving on from there to really try to get underneath what's going on with an individual beyond just the diagnostic terminology, and getting a much more clear and much more nuanced picture of who the person is. But not only that, how it is that we might be able to best intervene. And that really comes down to what we really like to be able to encourage people to learn how to do, and that is establish a very strong personalized clinical alliance. How do we do that? We've studied this quite a bit in our doctoral programs and in our studies and in our practice to be able to really find the best ways to speak to people, to really be able to meet them where they are at. And what we want to try to contribute with the MCMI, with the theory underneath it, with the interpretive material that you gain from using the interpretive report, which will be the focus of what we do today, using that information as best as possible to come into the same terms and really kind of stand in the same shoes as the person that you're working with. So this has some caveats with it, and we'll be covering that as well. But what we really want to try to be able to do here is to look at what it is that the MCMI and Pearson on a broader level, and objective psychological testing on an even broader level than that, what that provides for you, and how it is that can help you with your clinical enterprise, whether that be more of a straight clinical presentation, whether that be in a forensic setting, whether that be in community mental health, or whatever the situation might be. We want to try to be able to work with the person so that they can get as much out of the MCMI as we do as clinicians. So this begins the question, and one that we have on something of a regular basis, not only with the MCMI, but many of the instruments. And that is some basic parameters in terms of interpreting psychological tests and using particularly the interpretive material that comes along with that. Many of you might be familiar with the profile reports, which really kind of gives you a capsule summary, plus the graphical reports that indicate where the elevations are for any of the given scales in the different sections. But what we're going to be using today and really kind of looking towards is using the interpretive reports to their maximal ability. And that includes a couple of guidelines in terms of what is and is not appropriate to use, what the right perspective might be, and how to really pull as much as possible with a little bit of knowledge based on how they're constructed, how they've used theory to be able to make the statements that they have, how that's backed up by some empirical bases, and then how to best put that together in terms of how it is that you might approach a person that way. If you've come to any of my webinars in the past, you probably know that I tend to pack a lot of information into an hour's worth of time, and sometimes that leaves us with little ability to interact towards the end. I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. This is styled a little bit differently than others, and that is that there is not nearly as much substantive PowerPoint visual material as there has been in the past, but I do want to kind of move through this material, give it its due, but then also leave a decent amount of time for some question and answer towards the end. So with that in mind, I just want to make a couple of statements about the use of interpretive reports based on some of the information that you see in front of you right now. That is that the basic difference between the reports that are offered, all of the results that we offer when you have given somebody an MCMI-IV are used to assist your clinical understanding of the person. So on a more basic level, the profile reports provide you that graphic interface, the readout of all the scales and such, and a brief capsule summary that orients you to who the person is, a little bit of demographic information, and just a couple of highlights. The interpretive report, for this test or any test, what it tends to do, or what it really is designed to do, is to present statements that really highlight the most probable of features. And this is a really important distinction. Most people, I think, understand that the interpretive material does not pinpoint your client, although sometimes you may see some statements that are very close. Other times you'll find things that are not quite as accurate. That is because the report has not conducted an interview or gathered other clinical information from either other tests or from other sources of information, has not read the nonspecifics or the nonverbals that you may have read as a clinician. So the report does not know your client. It's a very important distinction. Therefore, it really needs to be taken into context and interpreted and used within the context of all the clinical information that's there. So the advantages to this methodology over just getting a profile report is that it does flesh out that simple diagnostic criteria. It helps you to kind of get an image of this person that might not be readily apparent immediately in front of you, whereas it still requires of you that you make the distinction of, does a statement fit or does it not? Or if there is a difference in the statement, what does that difference mean? So it can guide you in terms of your decision making. It can help you in report writing, and it can help in feedback provision. But throughout this, I really want to emphasize the word guides in terms of guides you, guides the clinician in doing all of the above. It's really not designed to be something that is any kind of a replacement for your own clinical acumen. So what then is the culminating benefit of that? It helps to create a more sensitized mindset. It helps to kind of help you get into the world of this person, whether or not it's an exact match or not at times. The reports are designed to really dive deep into the theory and highlight the connections and relationships between various constructs that may not be entirely obvious from what you gather from a clinical interview, from other materials. Other tests tend to highlight things perhaps that the MCMI doesn't. And in the example that I'll use today, I'm going to speak to that. Other times the MCMI does a better job at elucidating something that perhaps another test doesn't focus quite as well on. And all of the reports, whether the MCMI or others, is trying to base statements on established criteria. And that could be empirical correlates to specific statements. It could be theoretical statements themselves coming from an evidence-based theory of personality, such as Dr. Millon's, or ideally a synergy of both. Being able to really understand how it is that the marriage of empirical evidence and theoretical understanding produces really the most complete and really the most important kinds of criteria that we can use in our assessments. So, of course, this comes with some cautions. Number one, and I think this sort of creates the context for everything, and that is that if it hasn't been cleared already, I want to make sure that it's very clear that the reports are not idiographic. They're very numphatic. It may resemble an idiographic, and that is really just a very personalized kind of a report. Again, it doesn't know the person. It's based on a set of scores, not any personal information and not a personal interview. Although there are a few items that start out any administration, if you're using the computer scoring system, that ask things like what is your most important difficulty, what is your second most important difficulty, it's not taking that into account when it creates the substantive clinical matter. For this reason, then, it really is inappropriate for any kind of a direct cut and paste as far as taking sections of the interpretive report and using that in your interpretive, in your psychological report. Now, it probably goes without saying, and I hope that I'm not stating something that's far too obvious. I understand the conscientious clinicians really do understand that and have been trained appropriately, but you would be surprised that we do get these kinds of statements every so often from users of the various instruments. that they say that, I cannot use this in my report, and our answer to that is that's correct. You probably cannot. You may find a statement or two statements or several statements that really speak to what you're seeing, and you may want to use some form of that verbiage. But always make sure, and this goes to the last point on the page, you're exercising caution, and this is beyond just forensic use, but particularly there. Anything that you may use as more of a direct statement from the interpretive report, you want to be able to know in your mind that you can justify that. Anything that's auto-generated material in this sort of a way, you need to be able to think to yourself, if I were standing in front of a judge and I were defending my decision to make the statement, that I would feel comfortable in doing so. Okay, so with that behind us, I want to get a little bit more into what is included in the MCMI-IV interpretive report. Let me just update my other notes set here so I can get into this. So this interpretive report that is, you were paying more for this, and there's a reason for that. It is more expansive than a profile report. It does provide you a lot more of this information. It includes a fairly detailed narrative, and to my knowledge, one of the more complete contextual narratives of any of the tests that are out there. And that's always been a feature of the MCMI from the very early MCMIs, is that Dr. Millon took a lot of time initially to put together a lot of theoretical narrative that went from the theory to what he understood from his clinical mindset of how this may play out in an individual. Much more so than listing specific kinds of DSM criteria or highlighting components of what might make up a construct. This was really designed to be a very contextual and very synergized narrative report. The multiple sections of it reflect Dr. Millon's thinking in terms of really coordinating the various clinical domains. And that was, if you think back to how we looked at personality and psychopathology in the prior DSMs being a multi-axial kind of a system, and we know that the MCMI, one of the M's actually stands for multi-axial, and we've retained that, is that we're looking at different parts of what makes up this entire clinical picture. The MCMI and the way that the Millon inventories are constructed are rather personality-centric. So that really is kind of the starting point. But it moves itself out to immediate concerns, to syndromal aspects, to a number of statements that we might make regarding the severity of how a person is experiencing whatever their difficulties might be, whether or not their difficulties are ego-syntonic or ego-dystonic. And the example that I'm going to use today is kind of an interesting one because it is one where the person is rather ego-syntonic. They're there and they're probably not entirely sure from their own mindset why it is that they are, other than the clinical referral and what that stated. We'll get a little bit more into that shortly. But each of the sections follows a sequence, and it follows a logical sequence. And we'll get into that just next. I'm going to briefly move through the various sections of the MCMI. This is, in fact, the example that we'll be using later on today, but I've purposely not put these together in a way that it's easily readable. I just want to take you through first through the major sections and what they are, and then we're going to go back through that through this presentation to go into detail about how to really read this. Okay, so the first component that you would see, and those of you who are experienced MCMI users are familiar with this, would be the title page that gives some basic information. You can choose to use the client's name or not for purposes of confidentiality. Obviously, I have opted not to use any identifying information beyond basic demographics. And you'll see that this is basically titling the clinical report as an interpretive report, so we know which of the variants that we'll be looking at there. A couple of demographic notes that, where this person was seen, what their educational background is, what the basic circumstances are within their life, just really kind of a very quick capsule summary. We then move on to what we call the report summary. And again, this is very quick and easy as far as what's there. This is relatively similar to what you'd see in the profile report. So we begin with the report summary, which has a very boilerplate sort of beginning statement, followed by interpretive considerations, just kind of orienting you to the idea of who this person is, what they've complained about, what they've identified for themselves as their reason for being there, and a second paragraph that basically states that there is a bit of a tendency to avoid self-disclosure. There's a greater statement about that coming up in a later point, but you may see a statement under interpretive considerations that gives you something of an idea of what the test-taking attitude was. Make a basic statement about profile severity, as well as a brief statement about possible diagnoses, and we'll go into more detail in a later section as well. And finally, a few notes in the very simple form of therapeutic considerations. Now, this is the least substantive of the overall interpretive report, really just there as a guideline to give you some idea, sort of a quick and dirty measure of what you might be expecting in the more substantive components to come. I would say probably, arguably, the most important page of the overall interpretive report continues to be the profile. And this is the main profile page of the MCMI-IV. You'll notice on this particular form, and I'll just mention this briefly here, that alongside the left-hand side, you have multiple personality labels, and they're really the acronyms. These have been shortened, and this is an option, not necessarily something you have to use, but an option in reporting that allows you to use this profile page, if this is your style, with the person themselves, and to worry a little bit less and give you a bit more clinical power in terms of describing what the results are. So rather than having this blatantly show a label such as antisocial or sadistic, or something that a person might immediately move to a false positive on, this offers you the opportunity to be able to say, on this particular scale, and we label it this, and it's related to a DSM construct, which is whichever that might be, this shows that you have an elevation there. And we'll talk more about exactly how that works. We've also used that in the clinical symptomology down below as well. Second page of the profile report is a full readout of the Grossman facet scales. And here what we have, on this example, we only have 2 at the top, but you can have as many as 3. There is the 2 highest scores on the profile page from the previous page, and the facets that are underneath that. Those are the facets that go along with that particular scale. So one of these is the turbulent, one of these is the compulsive, and we'll get to what those mean when we get more into this particular profile. You can have 3. You can have the 3 highest elevations that are over a base rate score of 60, which makes them interpretable. And then for the facet scales to be fully interpretable, you would want to have them at a base rate of 75 or higher. Towards the bottom of the page, what we see down here in this section then are the entire group of Grossman facet scales. Sometimes it's important to look through these because sometimes we will see that something that didn't reach clinical significance on a major scale may show up down here and may be important to consider in our overall reading. Next, we have a fuller readout of the interpretive report. And again, we're going to be going through these in a lot more detail, but for now, we see the response tendencies, which is a brief statement about the avoidance of self-disclosure. It's a little bit more expansive than what was on that initial page, but a little bit of an orientation towards what to look for as far as a person's test-taking attitude. We then go into the personality patterns, and you can see this is a fairly involved, fairly long set of statements that really forms the narrative component of the overall report. This is then followed by several shorter statements. That's for the Grossman facet scales. and they are put in paragraph form, and there's a brief paragraph of about 3 sentences each for each one of the highest scoring of the facet scales that are relevant in those highest 3 readouts. The next section is clinical syndromes, and I'm going to make a very brief statement about that here because you see it's very short. This particular profile did not show any clinical syndromes that were highly significant. We'll get into what that means in a little while, but if you might expect this to be a longer, more involved narrative that is contextualized to the personality scales in many other reports. And this one it's not, and I'll show you what I did to kind of do some working around with that. Also noteworthy responses, and these are the items that have been identified as being very significant either because they're red flags for matters that really require an immediate intervention, or because they're identifying some areas of concern that are outside of the scope of the real wheelhouse of the MCMI-IV, things such as eating disorders or some cognitive difficulties, things like that. And then finally, in this component, we have a greater breakdown of the possible DSM diagnoses and speaks to clinical syndromes as well as personality or personality disorders. That includes, in this case, it would be styles because it doesn't quite reach the level of personality disorder. And then a brief statement on psychosocial and environmental problems as identified by the patient. Lastly, we would come to the treatment guide. The treatment guide is another narrative, a little shorter than the first, and designed to take you through what we believe might be a probable course of what to expect when you're intervening with this person. Beginning more so with what sorts of defenses a person might present, what you might expect in terms of trying to make those first inroads, and moving along throughout the narrative to what we believe might be the course as you go along through treatment. So trying to be as chronological as possible and also drawing from the theory and what the theory tends to predict in terms of what these difficulties might be. That goes on to the next page and that completes the report. So that's our basic overview of how the report is structured and what you might tend to see. And what I'd like to do for the rest of the substantive time that we have here today, and hopefully through the course of maybe about 15 minutes or so that we can leave a good 10 to 15 minutes at least to be able to discuss this, is to take you through a recent case. One that I thought was a good illustration of some unusual personality characteristics, one of which was that I received this, I'll call this kind of a second-hand case in a way. I received this referral after this person had been referred for another matter, and my referral question was twofold. One was to take a look at the initial testing and to say, what sense do you make out of this? And the second part of it to be, okay, this person was sanctioned, and part of the sanction, and it was a professional sanction, was to go through a therapeutic process. And what I opted to do, I wasn't sure based on some of the initial information whether it really warranted what I would call a more collaborative therapeutic assessment kind of approach, which is what I prefer to do. And that is a semi-structured means of going through a therapeutic course using assessment instruments as basically empathy magnifiers and agent for change in and of itself. I did kind of a quasi version of that because I wasn't sure, just based on some of the initial information, if this person might have been intellectually and emotionally curious enough to go through that entire process. And I think I probably could have done a more formal version of that. But what I did, it kind of matches a little bit more with a traditional psychological assessment approach, followed by some therapeutic material that followed, is I used the MCMI as well as a couple of other instruments to really kind of flesh out what was going on. So this is a case that was brought to me and brought to my attention privately through a healthcare attorney, and that is meaning a person who worked with healthcare professionals after they had been sanctioned by a state board. It was not in the state of Florida, it was elsewhere. We would call this a quasi-forensic sort of a case. It's a medical board remediation. This was a physician, an ER physician, who had previously been tested after a critical incident in which there were some questions as to whether he should be able to practice independently after that point. All I want to say about that, because it did get some notoriety and I don't want to disclose anything that I shouldn't, is that it's pretty clear that the person was practicing outside of the boundaries of what their particular job was, not in terms of what their qualifications were. Remember, this is an emergency room physician doing things that were really not emergency room oriented, a much different sort of a job, which you could potentially make the argument, and I understood this from the person, that doing what they did, in some ways you could almost make the argument that it was towards the ends of a greater good from a pure medical perspective, but it was really lacking in terms of what the true sensitivities were for the people that they were working with. So ultimately it came to me. So I was approached then, and I came at this with the agenda that I was going to use my assessment material to try to build trust in this process and try to gain in clinical alliance with this person. And as we go through this, you'll probably get some ideas to how guarded this person really was, how they really felt like they needed to put forth the very best picture. So positive impression management was a very big part of this overall picture. And let's just kind of take this through and see how this looks. So to begin with, let me get my bigger notes up here. This person, I want to say from the outset, on their initial testing was given another instrument that included some measures that highlighted positive impression management, resistance to treatment, and oddly enough, interpersonal warmth. But in the context of it, the medical examiner got the report from a neuropsychologist who had really done a neuropsych workup, and it was just a single measure to see what was going on with personality, which if most of us would have looked at it, they would have said nothing was going on with personality. But in the context of everything, the medical examiner decided to say, this person seems to have narcissistic characteristics and really needs some help in terms of developing theory of mind. Based on the referral question, I could see kind of where they were coming from, but it was really kind of a big jump. And you'll see that that is not what showed up, but something that makes a bit more sense is really what happened here. So this person, you can see right here, if you're familiar with the validity scales, desirability being one that really kind of showed up fairly strongly, although he's not giving a lot of information. If you look at disclosure, it's very low. Simple base rate of 15, it's almost not readable, but just in the ballpark where we have to make an adjustment to all of the scores in order to read that appropriately, giving us very little information. But this was not really how the person came off in their general quality. This person was friendly. This person had a smile on his face most of the time, showed himself to be very willing to engage in certain things, definitely showed a verbosity when given the Rorschach. He gave me 50 responses. Those of you who are Rorschachers out there know that that's pretty high. That's a personal record for me. But on these tests, he really didn't give us very much information. So we do see, and we look at the verbiage here, distinct tendency towards avoiding self-disclosure. Yes, absolutely. And it may signify a couple of different things. And this is where I really stress that these reports and this kind of narrative is not idiographic. It's really cast to represent a much larger group. So it says things like it may be a characterologic evasiveness or an unwillingness to divulge matters of a personal nature, problematic or not. This is somewhat tailored to the personality scales that are there. Most of the basic response tendencies tend to say the same things based on what the response scales are. But one that perhaps had more of an avoidant dependent kind of a characteristic may describe this particular layout of a very low disclosure, moderately high desirability, but not into the problematic range, might describe that slightly differently. So rather than not being a deficit in introspectiveness, it might be very introspective, but doesn't really wants to try to hide. So you might see some verbiage that looks more like that in a different profile. For this, it's saying a lot of the same things, but it's contextualized to really read in a match to what we might expect with some of the broad strokes that the personality scales are going to show us. The next component that we'll look at are the personality patterns themselves. And to kind of give you the context for what we're going to be looking at for the most part here, we have a fairly high elevation, and it's the highest elevation that we're looking at here, in the turbulent spectrum. And I'm going to describe theoretically a little bit more what that is, but that's the newest of the scales. And it is one that is based on sort of a hypomanic or exuberant kind of a characterology that is rather interesting in and of itself. It's relatively healthy up to a certain degree, and then it becomes very unhealthy rather quickly. And I'll go into more detail about that. The other component was compulsive. I just recently realized that they changed the terminology to perfectionistic in the ICD, but for right now we're still referring to this as the compulsive personality. Those are the two highest elevations, with moderate elevations in the two other oriented styles. That is also the dependent and the histrionic. Not as high, but we'll see that actually the facet scales may become, that didn't point to exactly where I wanted it to be, but the two above the turbulent, dependent and histrionic, not as high in terms of overall interpretability, but we'll see that there are relevant components from the facet scales in a little while. So with that in mind, I want to show you what the interpretive report tends to point out. The first component of the interpretive report, and this is fairly consistent across all of them, is a boilerplate paragraph that orients you to what you're going to be looking at. That is, these paragraphs refer to enduring and pervasive personality traits and so on. That really describes what is a personality and what are we really looking at in terms of the following paragraphs. And this one, this is only the beginning of it on this page, and the next slide we'll do the continuation of it. So this profile is obtained by two groups of individuals. This is something that you'll see on some interpretive reports, but not all. These tend to show up. This paragraph is not always there, but it is there on various elevations that are thought to use, the personality patterns are thought to use a pretty good amount of defenses, or if the personality on a less pathological level is thought to be one that is more of a strength-based personality, but becomes problematic when it becomes too extreme. So classically, the histrionic, the narcissistic, and the compulsive personalities, if they are all co-elevated to a moderate degree and we have a fairly good response pattern, that tends to be what happens when you give an MCMI to a person who's fairly well adjusted, because we're looking at characteristics such as conscientiousness, such as positive self-esteem, and such as sociability and agreeableness. I would argue, though, the research is just being conducted at this point, that the turbulent will probably join those three, in that a turbulent personality, one who is the only one that's oriented towards the pleasure or life-enhancing principle in the theory, and I'll go into more detail on the next slide with that, and really tries actively to pursue those goals. That's a fairly healthy kind of a personality attribute, unless it gets out of hand. When a person continues to pursue goals beyond what's reasonable, when a person begins to lose sight and lose consciousness of what's going on around them in terms of their situation, in terms of the people, and what effects their pursuits are really having on those people, then that becomes much more of a problem. So because of that, we have this paragraph where we see two groups of individuals. And a similar paragraph shows up in a number of these elevations that I just cited, and they all say relatively the same things with a little bit of difference depending on which elevations they are. This one says that the first group includes essentially well-functioning individuals. Adaptive individuals, no major personality disturbances, but they may be going through psychosocial stressors and have exhibited troublesome symptoms that are largely situational and transient in nature. And one of the things that they may try to do is downplay distressing emotions. That fits somewhat with the person who we're going to be looking at here. The second group of people tend to show the patterns as scores are the ones which this man appears to show up in do show some evidence of significant personality dysfunction. Individuals attaining this score tend to create difficulties in interpersonal relationships and unrealistic expectations for themselves. How do they do that? Now, take a very, very brief dive into the theory. If you've attended my workshops or any of the other webinars, you'll know that I go into quite a bit more detail about this, but very briefly, I want to show these two elevations within the theory. First of all, I just want to introduce that we have the evolutionary model, and I consider this to be the building blocks of all of the personality patterns, and what combinations show up tends to show you what kinds of difficulties and what kinds of conflicts a person might have, where it is that they place their emphases, and how it is that you can relate to that most effectively. It includes the polarities of existence, the basic idea of how do you live, whether you avoid things that might be troubling to life or whether you try to get as much out of life as possible. Next, adaptation, whether you tend to try to make things your own and make your environment what you want it to be, or whether you try to fit in, the passive versus active orientation there. And replication strategy in terms of whether or not you try to nurture others or save most of that nurturance for yourself. And depending on how extreme those are, depending on how conflicted they may be, we tend to show where our strengths and sometimes where our difficulties tend to lie. Looking at the particular patterns that are the highest elevations on this example, I'll spend just a moment on the turbulent and then a slightly lesser moment on the compulsive, although they are very closely related. They're both in sort of the high 60s in terms of elevations, which is not into the disordered range, but a range in which we want to pay attention. And we also want to say that this person didn't give us a whole lot of clinical information, so these results may be somewhat flattened. The turbulent, you look at where the orientation is there. The highlights there, the darkest shaded areas representing the strongest orientations, indicate that a turbulent, by theory, is someone who is actively oriented towards pursuing life-enhancing goals. Not a whole lot of room for just fitting in and allowing things to be, and not much concern whatsoever for what difficulties that may bring about. So that highly oriented, pleasure-active orientation, referring somewhat also to the deficits in passivity, deficits in terms of pain avoidance. That's great if you have a willing audience. That's great if you have people who are supportive. That's great if you are reading social cues and understanding where the natural limits are for you pursuing all that. These folks tend to draw people into their web, get people very interested, and really gather a lot of excitement. They are the gurus of our society. They are people who tend to be leaders in a lot of ways. And when it becomes too much, they tend to be people who tend to burn out others, and they tend to create deficits in their relationships because they have exhausted a lot of that goodwill and a lot of that interest that's come from other places. On the other side, we have the compulsive personality, and a basic passive other orientation is here, meaning that that goes into some conflict with the active orientation of the turbulent. But a little bit about the compulsive, a passive other orientation is very similar to a dependent in certain ways. But the passive is really not a behaviorally passive. It means that they want what's best for the world, not necessarily for themselves. They want what they believe to be the most altruistic, the most respectful, the most conscientious sorts of pursuits that they can muster. But do they get their own needs met? And that's why I tend to look at this, and the theory really kind of highlights this idea, the idea of a conflict between self and other. What creates the aggravation that a compulsive personality tends to see is that idea of, they're so good at sublimating and not meeting their own needs and putting that into the context of, this is for the greater good, this is for an organization that I believe in, this is for a belief that I believe in. That's what was going on with this person. That idea that he wanted to be the person who really brings the greatest good into the world through his work. And he was a rather spiritual, religious sort of a fellow. And he was also very committed to the idea that everybody should have very good access to medicine. So to that end, he was also, one of his other projects was building a rural hospital, a small emergent care kind of a hospital in a rural area that was underserved and was having a lot of difficulties politically with getting that moved across. I often had to move him away from him showing me statistics and showing me a lot of sort of extraneous information to kind of get him reoriented to the business at hand that we had. But you begin to understand when bringing it back to this person, and then we'll look at the interpretive narrative that goes along with this. This is a person who got himself in trouble because he didn't follow what his established organization wanted him to do, which was to simply do the business of ER care. He was not even a regular staff person. He was a per diem person in this particular organization, and went far outside those boundaries because he believed in a higher principle, but he was not sanctioned by that organization to do what he did. Nor was it a good decision overall. It was really lacking in terms of understanding what the mindset of the people who were involved, what they really needed. But he believed in the higher kind of a principle of, this is what's really necessary, this will give these people the most for what they really need as far as that goes, even though it was a very poor medical decision and almost catastrophic in certain ways. So let's take a look then at the rest of the narrative for the personality patterns. This goes into more detail. This is after a person might be this or might be that kind of a statement. The main part of this narrative then says, the profile of this man indicates a strong need to pursue unusually challenging endeavors. I'm sorry, that should be that's not going to undo, but unusually challenging endeavors and evince goal-directed behaviors, kind of like what we had just talked about. There we go. Thank you if somebody's helping me out in the background over there. And most importantly, okay, that's a good thing, but most others would find that unrealistic. So we can gather that kind of social support to a degree, but at some point that's going to be really kind of put aside. So this is really speaking to the turbulent component of this readout, but also includes some facets of the compulsive personality as well. Puts aside any kind of social doubts, feelings of inefficacy, really kind of relegates that to unawareness. And his relationships tend to mirror an illusion of high-spirited optimism and vibrant energy, but with some tenuousness that he does not easily acknowledge. I would say that was very true of this individual, that he could be very modestly aware of the effects that his pursuits had, say, on his family and, say, on other professionals with whom he had a relationship. The next statement here, I think, is not necessarily reflective of this particular person, but does help you sort of orient a little bit to the person who is there. Relatively few of his relationships are long-lasting. That was not true of this person. What was true was that they were long-lasting, but they were long-lasting only because they were somewhat superficial. And I noticed that even within familial relationships, even with the way that he would describe his ongoing relationship with mentors, that it was really so much based on a particular skill set that he was taught or a particular sort of iconic statement that might have been made, but very little about the real relationship underneath. Because really what his strongest relationship was to whatever it was he was focused on, which was usually work or usually some kind of a grander idea. And how long can you continue to really stay alongside of something like that as another person in this person's wake. As others show waning interest, he may become more absorbed by and concerned with their continued support and commitment. A major part of what he spoke to me about was why it was that he was having the difficulties getting his ideas across, which he wasn't having difficulty getting them across, it was in sustaining people. And when that would wane, you would see excited exuberance turn to edgy irritability. That is probably in this man's future. That was not something that had arisen just at that point, but something to kind of be aware of, and sort of brings you into the world of the compulsive in certain ways, and that is, what needs of your own are you not quite getting met? Difficult because another statement, and this is based more on the compulsive, and that is unwillingness to self-examine. That's a dangerous terrain for that kind of a conflicted self-other sort of a personality. And just the drive that continues on really ignores that unmet need, and it does set this person up for a kind of an exhaustion. Did that show up? Let's continue to take a look at what's going on here. We move in the theory from the evolutionary polarities to these, the functional and structural domains. That's what the facet scales are based on. So the expression of the evolutionary polarities ultimately comes out in a number of different areas, including the behavioral, phenomenologic, intrapsychic, and biophysical. And to a degree, these are outlined by the facet scales. So let's take a look at that. Let me update my other part of the slide and just see what's here in terms of going to the next level down in terms of the facets for these two scales. You see here that we have the turbulent and the compulsive, and the scales that became most relevant here are both in the compulsive scales, although this was the lower of the two, just by 1 point, but the lower of the two primary scales produced the higher of the facet scales, expressively disciplined, reliable self-image, both in places where I would kind of expect them. This was a little surprise, but I just want to kind of put my word out there. Cognitively constricted came in as a 0. It's very rare to get a 0 on the primary or the facet scales. Maybe 1 or 2. He had quite a few of these. But something to watch for. I would say that that's something that says that, you know, he's not really acknowledging that he thinks in rather black and white terms in certain ways. What does the group of facet scale statements say? And again, these are a little bit more straightforward. There's a boilerplate paragraph that kind of tells you a little bit about what the facet scales are all about, and then a couple of statements that I just want to highlight here. In the interest of time, I want to move through these a little bit quicker and then get to the Q&A section. But these give you a little bit more of a description of what's in the facet scales themselves. Highly structured and strictly organized life goes along with the expressively disciplined. This whole paragraph is really based around that idea. There may be a tendency to speak very precisely and dress in a very formal and proper way. Not really the case with him, but what he didn't dress as, he really presented as. He presented very formally, although he dressed, I would say, like in a casual Friday sort of a way. Big part of this is perfectionism. Frequently an issue as it limits the alternatives considered. So you want to put that into context again with some of these others from the turbulent. High-spirited, exalted self-image. I can do this. I've got a lot of energy with which to conduct all the business of my life. And these are the kinds of places where you want to start to combine your knowledge of the theory along with what is of assistance to you in terms of the verbiage that we have here. More about this, the reliable self-image, efficient, disciplined, meticulous. A lot of the same sorts of materials, but described more as how the person views themselves as opposed to how it is that they act. Let's move on just a little bit. I'm going to skip for now going into more of this, only to say that there was a couple of elevations that I wanted to pay attention to as well, and that was interpersonally submissive and attention-seeking. Putting that into the context with everything else added a flavor to the overall look at these different domains, this disciplined and reliable, high-spirited sort of a presentation, to add a few of these other components like submissive and attention-seeking. To me, one of the things that was so important was that despite everything else that was being presented here, he really was somebody who was looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of approval. I think he was really looking for my approval a lot of the time during our overall time together. And that was difficult to see. I'm going to make a little bit short order out of some of these other components. I want to mention just briefly the clinical syndromes, and a note to say that you want to get information from a number of different sources, because this was a case that the MCMI did not give you all of the information that might have been relevant that way. He showed very few elevations and nothing really in terms of clinical symptomology, but we did see, I gave an MMPI-2RF, and there was a mild elevation on scale 2. It was notable only because it was the only elevation. It was not clinically significant. And also some notable components of interpersonal passivity and introversiveness, which really kind of fed along that line of, was this person really looking for more approval? Surprising to me, and this is something that was really kind of important on the Rorschach, showed two very important elevations. Their depression index and coping deficits were both clinically significant. And there was almost a denial on the MCMI. So you really need to put those other components together, which in some ways belied the presentation, and I don't know that any objective test would have really captured this for this particular individual. But it's really notable that these were pretty much non-existent, and then they showed up in another place, and they were an area for exploration. So bringing that in, we really want to take a look at that in context with everything else. I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments about the last two pages, and that is that the ones having to do with noteworthy responses, very possibly denying significant problems that showed up because, in part, because the rubric that goes into that statement showed that the modifying indices really indicated a lack of giving us information and a tendency to really hold back a lot personally. So that statement may not show up in a more straightforward profile, but here it made the prediction that there very well may be some denied clinical symptomology. Clinical symptoms, like we said before, that came up as far as other testing is concerned. Personality disorders, it makes a brief statement about these, and that is two possibilities for what we call style. And remember that we classify in the MCMI world a style, which is basically a generally well-functioning individual, but may have certain particular difficulties in certain domains. A type, which neither of those were, which is more that we see more of the typology of the problematic characteristics, and a disorder where it matches closer to what we would consider to be a diagnosable range. Okay, once again, in the interest of time, my apologies for this. We did come up on a point where I would like to be able to get as much as we can to questions. I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Q to field any questions that might have come in or anything that we might believe would be a point of discussion in our last few minutes. Dr. Quiros?
Thank you, Dr. Grossman. So one of the questions that did come up was if you could go into a little more detail about how you use the modifying indices to help you interpret the rest of the report.
Sure.
Like what specifically do you do per the scales?
Okay, let me pull that one up for just a second. This is the page that we're talking about, and that is the response tendencies, the modifying indices. There is a score adjustment that's made when the disclosure is this low. I believe it's 5 points for specific scales. They were not adjusted for the particular scales that we were looking at. I think anxiety and avoidant personality and one other are adjusted that way. But what I would say, and really I think the most important component of this, is that it's a clinical hypothesis more so than an absolute statement. You want to bring in all of your information. But in a case like this, where we're really kind of looking at positive impression management and showing very, very little of what might be of concern, I would say that I adjust my expectations and say that, this reading as a personality style, I would probably think of it more as a personality type. I would say that it really deserves a little higher elevation, at least in my mind, in terms of the significance of the scores, if not making the diagnosis based on that. And because of that, I would adjust clinically to really kind of focus a little bit more on what's not being said. Maybe look at some nonverbals. Perhaps look at a lack of a statement and just ask the person, are you curious as to how other people might see that? You're saying that you're doing all this and you're not getting the answers that you want or need from other people. Other people might be really kind of pissed off about that. Does that surprise you? Other people might be saddened by what we're talking about. Other people might be in some way more emotively salient in some form or another. And I would open the door for the person to be able to try to explore that. And I did that with this person to some degree and to some benefit, I believe. Didn't work long enough to really be able to get more of a therapeutic effect that way, but I think we were headed that direction. And I hope that's helpful for just kind of looking at that perspective.
Thank you. Another question that came up was, are there cultural considerations in the interpretation of the scales?
Could you repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
Yes, the question is, are there cultural considerations in the interpretation of any of the scales?
I would believe so. We are really trying to encourage research in this area. It's not a place where we've gotten a lot. And it's quite a deficit when it comes to writing chapters and being able to really reflect on this, and it's hard to get right now. But I would say that the one thing that really has been established fairly well is you want to take into account an individualistic versus a collectivist culture. And that's been shown fairly consistently across a number of the scales, most obvious one. But that may show up in a lot of the scales that really highlight the interpersonal world and what the expectations are more societally. In terms of some of the more, I'd call more recent emphases that we put on perhaps LGBTQ, perhaps some other alternative populations, that is something that I think, again, we really do need to encourage as much as possible, as much cross-cultural research as we can.
Great, and I know we're a little over time, but this might be a quick answer for you. Can you interpret Grossman scales if the parent clinical scale is not meaningfully elevated?
You can. The short answer is you can. There's a little bit more of a detailed answer, but as briefly as I can put it, to have them fully interpretable, which means that you want to consider that as part of your major report, you do want to have the parent scale come up to the level of 60, which is not clinically elevated, but it is where it becomes more significant, such that somebody who has certain personality tendencies more in the style range, that may be an area for that. I tend to look at, if they're more highly elevated, I tend to look at them more seriously because it may be just an outlying component. But again, you're looking at the person, reflecting on whether that seems to be something that's truly relevant for them or not. And that's really where you base your criteria.
Great. Thank you very much. This is, we're over time, so I'll hand it over to Sherry. Or if not, all right, Sherry, I think I had to drop off. Seth Grossman, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you so much for sharing this wonderful information for us. For everyone else in attendance, if you have any further questions, feel free to use those emails that you see on the slides at the moment, and we'll be able to get answers to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much for attending, and have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.